So, right now I want to do a review of Andrew Lloyd Webber's sequel to The Phantom of the Opera, Love Never Dies. Now, this has recently hit DVD in the UK and it comes out in America in May. The show has got a checkered past. It's unbelievably interesting the way that the reaction had happened to this, as any musical sequel should be. And it's actually probably, I would claim it is the first musical sequel that's actually been relatively successful, despite all of the drama that has occurred with it. I happen to love the show. I'm a big fan of Love Never Dies, so I'm going to say that right now. So if you're looking for somebody to tear this show apart, it's not going to be me. But I'm not also going to blindly praise it. I love it, and I think it's wonderful, but at the same time, there are issues in this show, and I want to be able to cover them. So, first off, here's the inception. Back in the 90s, Andrew Lloyd Webber and Maria Bjornson were out to lunch or something, and they talked about the idea of continuing the show because, Maria Bjornson was saying how, the ending, it's great, but, it could be a little unsatisfactory, she ends up just going off with Raoul and leaving the Phantom, and, the idea is that the Phantom and Christine had this deep, soulful connection. So what if you were to continue it? And Andrew Lloyd Webber ended up working with author Frederick Forsyth on a plot idea, and they got really far with it. And he even wrote songs to be in the sequel, and one of them is called The Heart Is Slow to Learn, which was performed at his 50th birthday party at the Royal Albert Hall. And, of course, that melody eventually became Love Never Dies.
I would like to introduce Kira Tikanawa, and she's going to be singing a song from what I would like to believe could be the continuation of the story of the Phantom of the Opera. So, Dame Kira Tikanawa.
Slow to learn, the heart is slow to learn, and these feelings that I feel are foolish but they're real. I'm wise enough to see this love will never be, and each day's like the last when living in the past. I know it's mad and you won't return, but then, as I have said, the heart is slow. Slow to learn, the heart is slow to learn. You'd think there'd be a way to shut out yesterday. Perhaps if I just thought of all the times we've fought. I've tried to let but know there's still no letting go. I know it's mad and you won't return, but then, as I have said, the heart is slow.
That's The Heart is Slow to Learn. Unfortunately, things didn't really work out with that. He couldn't figure out quite how to make the plot work, and he ended up throwing it away. And Frederick Forsyth just took that and made it into a novel after Weber decided that he wasn't going to continue the show. And the novel is interesting to say the least. A lot of the basic plot elements ended up going into what would eventually become Love Never Dies, but there was a lot of characters that just weren't needed, a little too much over political stuff and over historical stuff of bringing in Oscar Hammerstein and having him actually be a big character within the piece, and you have these other characters who are his front men, but they're nobody you actually care about. And it's interesting. And I would say, if you have time, pick up the book. It's not particularly well written. It's on the level of Twilight and bad writing. But it does have a somewhat interesting plot to it. So if you have a morbid curiosity, pick it up. But it's not something you need to pick up. And it definitely has a lot of issues as a book. So I can't really say I fully recommend it. But anyway, so let's fast forward to 2006. Between this time, Andrew Lloyd Webber had taken the song that he wrote for Love Never Dies, The Heart is Slow to Learn, and turned it into Our Kind of Love and put it into A Beautiful Game. The Beautiful Game ended up failing miserably, and eventually became The Boys in the Photograph. At this point, he had an inkling that he was going to come back to the sequel, so he removed the song Our Kind of Love, which was a very pop rendition of that melody, and I don't think it works particularly well. But he ends up removing that song when it gets remade into The Boys in the Photograph, and puts it off to the side, and it eventually becomes the song Love Never Dies, and it goes right back into the sequel where it's supposed to be. Now there's controversy over that, because people are like, oh, he should have just wrote a new song, blah blah blah. But he wrote it for the Phantom sequel, and it's a beautiful piece, and it's meant to be like that. It was meant to be like the penultimate number that she sings. It's this piece that, in the book, the Phantom wrote to lure Christine back, and she thinks it's so beautiful she has to come in. Luckily that plot idea changed, because that's really tacky as hell. But it's still the song that he wrote for her to sing at, his opera house. It's great, and most people didn't even realize The Heart is Slow to Learn existed. And most people don't even realize about Our Kind of Love existing, especially in America, because that show flopped and never even made it anywhere near America. So, Americans especially, no clue. If you mention The Beautiful Game, they're like, what the hell's The Beautiful Game? So, yeah, there's all that. So, that's kind of the inception points and everything. So, in 2006, he starts working with Ben Elton, and Ben Elton's like, well, the problem with the story is you have too many characters that nobody cares about. How about you just make his frontman the Giris, and so on and so forth. And that was a brilliant move, because it just makes it so you have the same four of the same characters that you had in the original, and they're people that you actually can connect with more because you already know them, and so on and so forth, and it makes it feel more like a sequel. And that really works out in the end for this story. So that's all I have to say about that for now. The original title was Once Upon Another Time. But then a month later, he's like, nope, the title's going to be Love Never Dies. So I always thought that was interesting, because I love the song Once Upon Another Time, and I feel like it kind of captures the emotion of what the show is doing. Those feelings of regret, of looking back on your choices and thinking, what if I had done something different? That's really the idea of the show. So, Once Upon Another Time is kind of a better title in that idea, but it just doesn't work really well when you're trying to sell a show. So, they ended up changing it to Love Never Dies, which is a lot more of a sellable title, but it doesn't give off that feeling of the show that I feel like Once Upon Another Time would have. All the same, it's a title, and both work very well. So, I would go over the general plot at this point, but I would like to imagine most people know what's going on already, and I'm going to hit the general plot later when I'm discussing the show itself. So, let's fast forward to the London show. The show opens up in London, and it comes out to mixed reviews. lots of them are glorious, and they're like 5-star reviews, and they're like, oh my god, we love this show, and then a lot of them are like 3-star reviews. There weren't a lot of complete slams of this show. Most people who reviewed it were very much, the score is amazing, we love this music. The score is one of the things that was praised all the way through, and all the reviews. The story took a lot of hits. And there's a main issue with the story. And the issue with the story is, the ending of Phantom of the Opera is so ambiguous, and you can interpret it like a million different ways to Sunday. And when you make a sequel, you have to take one interpretation and base your sequel off of that. Because you can't do 20 different shows saying all the different ways the story could have continued. You have to take the one interpretation and do that. And the one interpretation it's based off of is, Christine was in love with the Phantom. She absolutely was in love. And the Phantom loved her. And the idea that Christine went off with Raoul because really that was just the smarter choice, even though it may have not emotionally been the right one. If you don't buy into that idea, though, that Christine was in love with the Phantom and had a deep, soulful, sexual connection with him, just don't flip on Love Never Dies if you can't buy into that. Because you're never going to accept the story. And that's pretty much it. That's all there is to it. That is the biggest issue, especially since we find out in the sequel that they do end up, after the events of Phantom of the Opera, Christine tracks him down, and they have sex with each other. In the Night of Passion. If you can't buy into that, you just shouldn't flip on this show. And that's all there is to it. I think it's done really well within the show, and they managed to convince you that that connection has happened, and it was deep and meaningful. I think it's really well done in the show, but there's people who just philosophically are against that idea. And those people are mainly the people who are involved with the Love Should Die group on Facebook and online. And this was one of the first big things I had ever seen of like a group trying to sink a show. Because, I mean, I've seen hate groups before, because I'm in the Star Wars community, and there's people who absolutely hate the prequels. And you see a lot of hate for that, the prequels all the time. Yet the prequels were still wildly successful, because, like, nobody really cared that much about the haters and what they were saying. Love Should Die, on the other hand, the person who was in charge of the group, who never really outed themselves, managed to find every single article, review, everything, and they kept throwing, like, their comments all over these, like, constantly saying how much they hated the show, or how much they hate the ideas of the show, and how Phantom needs no sequel, so on and so forth. And though I agree that Phantom needs no sequel, it doesn't need one, I appreciate this sequel, and I really do love it and enjoy it. Did it need a sequel? Nothing needs a sequel. I can't think of a single great movie that absolutely needs a sequel. Did Godfather need Godfather Part 2? No. But is Godfather Part 2 worth watching? Damn right. Did Star Wars need The Empire Strikes Back? No. But is Empire Strikes Back great? Yes, and that's kind of how I feel about Love Never Dies. Phantom didn't need a sequel, but the sequel is totally worth watching, and it's a worthy follow. But you have the Love Should Die group, and Weber now believes that it was professionally run, and that the main person in charge of it, who was finding every single article, was actually a professional member of the press trying to sink the show. I don't know if any of that's true. Supposedly they found evidence for it, and I could believe it because it was no more than 2 seconds after these posts went up. Any article went up that these guys were like, bam, right on it. It was just so quick the way they got on it all the time. But in the end, I think people give Love Should Die too much credit. Yes, it was an online thing against the show, and it was causing problems. But not that much of problems. What was really causing more problems was just the fact of the reviews were very mixed, and people went and saw the show, and something about the London production just wasn't working correctly. Now, to me, a lot of the problem is based on 3 things. There was the fact that it didn't look right. It looked amazing, but it didn't look right for the show that they were doing, especially being a sequel. It didn't look gothic enough. It wasn't dark enough. it was a little too, like, pristine and pretty, and it didn't have those great colorful gothic moments of, like, masquerade that you get in the original Phantom or anything like that. And they used a lot of digital projections during the thing, and, you know, digital projections, a lot of audience members always argue about feeling nauseous during that. If anybody remembers the show Woman in White and so on, there was a lot of people who were very upset with the digital projections within that show, because, you know, it's like watching 3D movies. It's an acquired taste. It doesn't always work for everybody. So there is all of that. That's an issue for the show. And it was just, it didn't look very Phantom-like. It didn't jump out at you visually. Something that the Australian show has in spades. The Australian show is completely different, but I will get to that. Then you have the fact of the story structure. The structure and the song structure just was not working. I remember when I first heard the album, and I'm listening to it, and I'm actually pulling up my iTunes now so I can read this, read these track listings off, because it just was not working at all. And, yeah, let's look at it. There was this awful prologue in the beginning, and of course they were trying to replicate Phantom and be like Phantom structurally, but this prologue did absolutely nothing for the rest of the show. It didn't set up any real mystery. It didn't set up anything really interesting at all. It was just there to be like Phantom, and that didn't work out. And it's all information that you can give out in a better way during the show. There was no reason for this prologue to be there, and that eventually got exercised. Then there was the Coney Island Waltz, which is meant to be the overture of the show. And that is a very pretty melody, and I love that melody. And it's great. Then it gets followed, though, by this awful song called Heaven by the Sea, which sounds like a friggin' Disney number. Here, take a listen to this.
Hurry up!
You won't believe it.
Take a look what's over here.
Who imagined just how big the place would be?
The man called Mr. White put it up in just a year.
It's a little slice of heaven by the sea.
Look! There's restaurants.
A Midway.
A gigantic
The biggest
concert hall.
funhouse ever seen. Volcano that erupts each day at 3. Wonders bubbling around the world. The season's just begun and Mr. White has got it all.
Crystal fountains.
Grand Pavilion. Hell, it must have come.
Yeah, it is absolutely atrocious, and it did end up, it's still actually in the show, but it got changed into a minor key, and it sounds very haunting, and it's now the 10 Long Years duet. And now listen to this version. This is from the Australian version, and it's still technically the same song, but it's not.
Fixed her aim on wealth and fame, fled from the master, yet fled with his heart.
It seems 100 years ago when you and I were both on show, dancing side by side, shy and starry-eyed. The waves now bring you back to me, and any day we soon will be side by side again, just the same as then.
Oh, Christine, long ago, how I watched as you rose like a star. Ah, Christine, we have all traveled, long traveled far. Ah, Christine,
We seem 1,000 miles away, and yet your ship sets out today, sails across the sea, bringing you to me. And I will show you all the sights, Manhattan's noise and Coney's lights, friends at last again, just the same as then, just like way back when.
Yeah, that song occurs after the changes in structure were made, because it did not exist like it did before. So I better get off of that. That's followed up with a song called Only for Him and Only for You. That song's still in the show, but in the London version, it makes it sound like she's in love with the Phantom, and there were people who had issues with that. The idea of Meg in love with the Phantom, that doesn't make sense, and that got completely changed and exercised, and that whole plot change was welcome as far as I'm concerned. And so, like, the opening, like, I believe that goes for like 25-30 minutes before you even get to the Phantom in the original London production. And it just doesn't really work. It's slow, it's arduous, there's not much to it, you haven't gotten to the point yet, and it just does nothing for the show. The story hasn't been moving at all, and it's not interesting. And then you get to the Airy, Until I Hear You Sing, and that's when the show finally takes off. But the problem is, there's just too much downtime in the beginning to really make it... Like, once you've spent that much time and you're not sold by a show, the rest of the show is going to have a lot of trouble making up for a very lackluster beginning. And that was the issue with the London show for me. So the whole first act is kind of a mess. And then you have the Phantom, like, luring Christine to come to Coney Island, and it's like he sends out a letter pretending, like, well, he's not even pretending to be somebody else, but he sends out a letter with like this huge amount of money, being like, I'm gonna pay you this much if you come here and sing, and so on. And there's just so many story issues, and I can keep going, but the story just... It was not the story's fault, if you ask me, because I still like the story. It's the execution of it and all the detail work that really killed this thing off in London. And they knew that. And so they kept making changes. And the show was changing all the time. And Weber kept expressing how he wasn't happy with the show. And this is the biggest problem. First off, who wants to see an unfinished show? Wait for them to finish making all the changes, and then I'll shell out a shit ton of money to go see a show on the West End. Because it costs so much money to go see anything in the theater. So if a show isn't done yet, why go see it? Like, I want to see a show when it's at its best. And Weber kept saying how he wasn't happy with the way things were in London, that he wasn't happy with it. And if the composer's saying that, why do I want to go see that show? So basically Weber ended up, he blames the Love Should Die group, and he really shouldn't. The only person he really has to blame is himself, because if he would have just taken pride in it and been like, it's great, it's wonderful, it's brilliant, in its actual form right now, I think an audience would have gave it more of a chance. But when you have the composer going around saying, oh, I'm not happy with it, I'm not happy with it, it's gonna die. So of course, Love Never Dies in London died off. But it wasn't before the Australian group already started doing what they were doing, and they completely restructured it. Actually, a lot of credit for that goes to Bill Kenwright, who came in and was like, this song needs to go here, this song needs to go there, this song needs to go there. And then the Australian group is like, well, we should start changing some of the plot stuff too. How about we have Christine believe the Phantom is dead? Like, the Paris Opera House, or the fake Paris Opera House, which Phantom takes place in, the Opera Populaire, burns down. And Christine believes the Phantom's dead now. And for 10 years, she thinks he's dead. So that way, when he shows up, it's all the more shocking for her character. Which actually does help her character out a lot. And other changes, like, have it be another opera impresario. Have it be Oscar Hammerstein's luring her there. And, like, is being like, oh yeah, come here and sing. We'll give you a lot of money, so on and so forth. And then have the Phantom get in the way. Have it more like, he's not pulling all the strings to make it happen, but once she's already coming to New York, he can't resist it. So that way it's not fully the Phantom's moving backwards. Because at the end of Phantom of the Opera, he gives up the girl. He gives up Christine. He knows that's the right thing to do. And that, she'll be better off with Raoul is what he believes. So to fully, make that sacrifice correct, yeah, you couldn't have him being the one forcing everything fully. So when he finds out that she's going to be in New York, big change. I mean, it's small, but it strikes me as, no, it's serendipity. And something like that happens. Your ex-girlfriend is now right in your backyard. Can you resist the temptation to basically call them up? So that's what goes on with that. And Act 2 is actually still pretty much exactly the same as it was. Again, they cut like reprises of Heaven by the Sea, and they tightened it up a bit. But for the most part, Act 2 is... That was always working. So there's that. But Act 1 has massively changed from what it was in the London. So, now the Australian version's out on DVD, and now it's time to start talking about what's going on in the Australian version.